Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. So as the 1970s unfolded, classical theorists saw what was happening and they became emboldened once again to oppose Keynesianism and the use of fiscal policy to influence aggregate demand. It was obvious as a result of this time period that short-run aggregate supply had a major role in terms of how it was going to determine the standard of living for people in different parts of the world, particularly the United States. But not only short-run aggregate supply, but the role of theories with regards to expectations really started to take hold as well, and that's what I want to talk about here. First of all, the natural rate theory, or this theory that there is a natural rate of unemployment, natural rate of output as well. In a famous book, A Theory of the Consumption Function, 1956, Milton Friedman, who is another Nobel Prize winning economist who passed away a couple of years ago and is associated with the Chicago School of Economics, argued that consumer spending depends mainly on the income people expect to have over the long term, rather than on their current income. People spend based on what they think they're going to have not too long from the present day. In 1968, Friedman proposed that expectations about future inflation directly affect the present rate of inflation. And he had what's called the natural rate hypothesis, which says that since inflation is eventually embedded in expectations, to avoid accelerating inflation over time, the unemployment rate must be high enough that the actual inflation rate equals the expected rate of inflation. And attempts to keep the unemployment rate below the natural rate will lead to an ever-rising inflation rate. Most economists now believe that expected rate of inflation is the most important factor other than the unemployment rate affecting inflation. So go back and look at Exhibit 4. It was right here. And let's visualize that we go from point 1 to point 2 along this short-run Phillips curve, or the corresponding aggregate supply and demand graphs, window 1 and window 2. And let's say that this happens as a result of government action. If the government unexpectedly increases AD from AD1 to AD2 using fiscal policy or monetary policy, and I know we haven't talked yet about monetary policy, but you'll learn before too long about how many economists believe you can use the money supply to achieve a lot of the same goals that you do with fiscal policy, namely, in this case, decreasing the money supply by using the tools of decreasing the reserve requirement, decreasing the discount rate, buying bonds, or a combination of these. Or, of course, we could get from window 1 to window 2 by using fiscal and monetary policy, throwing as much spaghetti against the wall and hoping as much of it can stick as possible to try to help us from spiraling downward as we did around 2008 when we were experiencing the Great Recession, as they call it. What does all this mean to Friedman if he sees this going on? Well, Friedman contended that the trade-off between unemployment and inflation is not going to last. And as a result, the actual inflation rate increases. So let's say government takes this action and prices rise 4%, for example. But in the short run, because it was unexpected, people don't know this, and they still expect inflation to stay where it is at some lower point, let's say 2%, for example. We have this brief gap between reality and perception, which leads to a temporary shortage of goods and services and higher prices. So producers step up production, increasing their quantity and decreasing the unemployment rate. But in time, people become aware of the actual inflation rate, and the expected inflation rate adjusts. In particular, the workers, especially if you're in a union, they start to demand higher wages as they start to become aware of what the actual inflation rate is. They're not content to say, oh gosh, what we got before is fine. We need to be able to keep pace with inflation. We've talked about this. You don't want the value of your dollars that you're earning at your place of work to erode. And so they demand higher wages. Some workers decrease their hours at their current jobs, looking for better paying jobs, or they actually quit their current jobs for new jobs that pay more. You'll recall this is known as frictional unemployment, like when Mr. Gideon left from Notre Dame to come to Chaminade. So what happens next? This leads to higher wage rates, which shift SRAS to the left, and we move from window 2 to window 3. That's a description of Friedman's natural rate theory, or the Friedman fooling theory, because it shows how workers can be temporarily fooled. But it is temporary. Eventually they're going to become aware of what the actual inflation rate is, and the economy will return to the natural rate of unemployment. His theory implies that individuals form their expectations by looking at past inflation rates, which enables them to get fooled. They're looking over their shoulder, essentially, when they try to understand or anticipate what's going to happen next. And then they adapt after they realize their mistake. It's called adaptive expectations. So adaptive expectations go hand in hand with the natural rate theory. And here's a definition of adaptive expectations. So this is an important contribution by Friedman, but the role of expectations and our understanding of expectations evolved over time, and in this case gave rise to a new group of classical theorists called the New Classicals. Some of the classical theorists, these New Classicals, disagreed with Friedman, even though they're on the other side of the aisle from Keynes. They believe that enough people form their expectations not by looking over their shoulder, but by staying plugged into current events and being able to anticipate what's about to happen in the economy. And so New Classicals called this rational expectations. It was originally introduced by John Muth in 1961, and it became more popular later. But in this case, there won't be much fooling going on, and the economy won't even get to be stuck in a temporary inflation gap like is shown in the figure that I told you to scroll up and look at. It really helps to be able to see that visual as I'm talking about these things. It's just going to move the price level straight up when the government tries to take this policy action, because people are going to be adjusting simultaneously to whatever policy action they think the government's going to give. A lot of times the government announces these things, whether it's fiscal policy or monetary policy. They make an announcement about what they're going to do to try to help the economy. According to new classical theorists, there's enough people, especially today, I think you could really visualize this with the internet and how easy it is to get information, not only to go and search it out, but you can have news alerts set up so that it comes directly to your phone, and enough of those people in the world who are plugged into current events have the power to make adjustments as soon as an announcement's made. Now, keep in mind the fact that we still have something called lags, particularly with regards to fiscal policy, not as much with monetary policy. And so this is something that really concerned new classical theorists. They felt like, as you're going to see in a minute, if the government's trying to do something with the economy to make it better, all they might end up doing is making prices go straight up without any temporary relief. But this is a major difference between Friedman and adaptive expectations as compared to the new classical theorists and rational expectations. And here's a visual that helps you hopefully see that. So on the left-hand side is the embodiment of Friedman. Friedman said, okay, so let's say we're at long-run equilibrium, then the government unexpectedly does something that shifts AD to the right. They use fiscal policy like cutting taxes, increasing spending, increasing transfer payments, or they use monetary policy. They decrease the money supply using tools to do that. Maybe they do all that stuff. According to Friedman, we'll get stuck at point 2 for a little while until workers wise up and they say, we need higher wages to keep pace with inflation. And then because eventually their wishes are granted, if you're a producer that has to pay these laborers, well, that of course takes some resources away from you and you have to cut back on production. And so SRAS shifts to the left and the adjustment takes place, assuming wages and prices are flexible, and all we end up doing in the long run is just making prices higher. So we go from point 1 to point 2 for a little while, and then eventually point 3. This is where the fooling takes place, at point 2, where we get stuck for a little while. But according to rational expectation theory, you have enough people plugged into current events that are able to anticipate what's going to happen that SRAS shifts to the left at the same time that AD's shifting right. And so we don't even have a momentary period of time where we're over here in an inflationary gap, we just go straight up and we experience higher prices. That's the difference between the two camps of classical theorists. Not all people have to anticipate policy according to the new classical theorists. As long as some people do, rational expectations theory will prevail. Who are some people that do this with regularity? People that anticipate policy and might hire professional forecasters. Investors, labor unions, people that work for banks. What about these two groups? Let's say labor unions. If labor unions are in charge of trying to get the best possible financial compensation for the members of these unions, of course they want to try to look forward at what the inflation rate is going to be and make sure that the pay that they're negotiating for these contracts that last 3, 4, 5, who knows, 10 years are going to be enough to get them through the years as prices rise. Same thing with banks. We've talked about the difference between nominal and real interest rates, and that a real interest rate is the nominal rate minus expected inflation. That's a really important part of your calculation. And so banks would be willing to hire professional forecasters, or at least have enough people in their organization smart enough to have an intelligent view about what policy might be taking shape over the coming years. People that have export businesses, because inflation affects the exchange rate and between currencies. We're going to talk about that before the class is over. Someone thinking of refinancing his or her mortgage. And now that you are aware of this, if you weren't before, hopefully you are able to more clearly pay attention to current events and anticipate policy, as well as what that could do to your life with regards to unemployment and inflation. But how do people form their expectations? What about you, for instance? What do you expect the inflation rate to be over the next year? Take a guess. And if you really want to have fun, check on your guess a couple of months from now. Write your guess down and then come back and look at it. You know where the links are. They're going to take you to the CPI calculation. You can find the PPI. It's not hard for you. But what are you basing your answer on? Are you basing your answer on historically what it's been? Are you basing it on news that's been breaking recently? If you're somebody that's looking over your shoulder and you're just saying, well, it seems like roughly for several years now we've had an inflation rate of about 2%, then you might seem to fit more into Friedman's model, somebody that is adaptive in nature, and you could get fooled. If you're somebody that is reasonably well informed, you don't necessarily have a crystal ball, but you can anticipate policy and how that's going to affect the economy and your surrounding economic life, then you fit more in the rational expectation theory. Another example of this is a relatively unscientific exercise, but fun nonetheless, is when a few years ago at Chaminade, I asked my AP Econ students to go out into the public and ask people what they thought the Fed was going to be doing in the next 6 months. Now, the Fed is, in our context, short for the Federal Reserve, or the Federal Reserve Board. That's the head of the banking system, essentially, in the United States. And they had to go and get 20 people on camera that they could ask this question to and see what the response was. And the bottom line was, did they have any kind of anticipation about what the Fed might be doing? They certainly didn't have to have a crystal ball either. But it was shocking how few people even knew what we were talking about. There was one guy in particular, I'll never forget, who was asked, what do you think the Fed's going to do in the next 6 months? And he said, oh, I think K-Fed's going to break up with Brittany. So he was thinking about something completely different, of course. Most people said, what's the Fed? And so, not that the Federal Reserve System and monetary policy is more important than fiscal policy, but our unscientific results seem to indicate that most people are pretty adaptive and ready to be caught off guard or fooled, according to Friedman. But either way, the case for government involvement in the economy looks pretty questionable, because whether we get temporary relief, or we're in a gap for a little while and we're fooled or not, it looks like in the long run all that's going to happen according to these theories is that prices are going to be higher. at least in the eyes of classical theorists. Even worse, they believe it might be possible to incorrectly anticipate policy, and if so, make life worse than it would have been otherwise. Here's a visual showing that. Let's say we start at point 1 and the government says that they're going to take some action, and people anticipate that it's going to shift AD all the way to the last AD curve. If we start here at AD1 and we go all the way to the anticipated shift, and people make an adjustment as soon as that announcement is made, but then ultimately the government doesn't take as much action as they thought, or at least that they announced they were going to, we could end up in a recession. We could start in long-run equilibrium and take a significant step backwards. So according to new classical economists, expectations are really, really important. And if the government, any part of the government, says that they're going to do something, then they better do it, because otherwise it can get us into trouble, and the next time they won't be believed. So rational expectations theory became very influential, thanks in part to Robert Lucas during the 70s and 80s. But this wasn't the end of the story. Keynesianism was not dead. It's not dead today. Keynesians came along and said that, well, you know, rational expectations is a reasonable explanation for how things take place. But they weren't going to go along with this complete wage and price flexibility that classical theorists are so well known for. Why? Well, first, because long-term labor contracts often prevent wages and prices from adjusting quickly to these anticipated changes. So maybe you can anticipate changes. Maybe you're, you know, the head of a labor union, or you're with a bank and you feel like some changes are going to take place. You're not always at liberty, particularly if you're talking about long-term labor contracts in the case of unions, to make any kind of change, because you're contractually obligated to take the pay that you've already agreed to. And this can be significant. You know, what's a current day example? You know, let's say, you know, you're in a union and you're in year 2 of a 6-year contract, you're stuck. Well, as of July 1st, 2011, we have only the second time in our history a major work stoppage in 2 pro sports: NFL, the National Football League, and the NBA, National Basketball Association. In particular, the NBA right now has a major sticking point between the owners and the players, because the owners want a new deal for 10 years and the players want a 5-year deal. If you stop and think about this, it seems kind of counterintuitive. You would say, gosh, if I'm a player, if I'm a worker, and it's sometimes difficult to visualize, oh, I don't know, Kobe Bryant or LeBron James or Dwayne Wade or Dirk Nowitzki as a worker, but that's what they are. They're multimillionaires, but they're workers. It's hard to visualize why a worker would want only a 5-year contract, you know, that's governing the terms for individual player contracts, rather than a 10-year contract. Because you go, 10 years is better than 5, I got something guaranteed. Well, this is part of the reason. It's because you don't know exactly what's going to happen economically. You want to have a shorter term contract before you renegotiate a new contract, and so that you have more flexibility to make adjustments to the economic environment you find yourself in. What's the reality either way? 5 or 10 years is still a good stretch, and it's not the complete wage and price flexibility that classical theorists claim prevail in the marketplace, at least not in all markets. So this is a point that new Keynesians make with regards to rational expectations. They also say that companies often engage in fixed price contracts with their suppliers, and they don't always have the flexibility that classical theorists say prevail throughout the economy. So according to new Keynesians, SORAS doesn't shift all the way back to long-run equilibrium the way that classical theorists say it's going to. Here's a visual for that. You might want to stretch it out and look at it more clearly, but we could start in point 1 and AD takes place. And SORAS, because there's some inflexibility in the system due to, you know, collective bargaining agreements and union contracts, also due to producers wanting fixed price contracts, that's in their interest. SORAS can only shift so far back and not get us all the way back to long-run equilibrium. So it's, you know, it's a struggle between the classical theorists and the Keynesians, including the new classicals and the new Keynesians, long after Hayek and Keynes started this ball rolling in so many parts of the world. As you can see, the two sides over the years, over several decades, started to get closer and closer in terms of what they believed was the reality with regards to economics, as well as what should be done with economic policy. Sorry, I jumped forward there. The last thing I want to say about expectations connects with what's called the real business cycle theory. Some economists believe that changes in real GDP don't originate on the aggregate demand side, which is what we've been emphasizing up to this point, but on the supply side of the economy. They believe changes can result from a shift in long-run aggregate supply, actually, particularly in the leftward direction as productivity decreases. Productivity could also increase and the chain reaction would be different. But recall that these arrows are shorthand for saying leads to, and according to the real business cycle theorists, they would say if productivity decreases and now you have LRAS shifting to the left, firms are going to reduce their demand for labor while price level increases. That's going to lead to an increase in the unemployment rate, and of course real wages are falling because prices are rising. That's going to lead to workers reducing their consumption, right? Because now their real wages have fallen. They might be getting paid the same nominal wage, but it's not worth as much because prices are going up. Some of these workers are unemployed. So now consumption starts to fall. Workers can't afford to buy as much. Firms then, who don't have the number of sales that they're used to, have to cut back more, and we have this possible downward cycle. We'll talk more later about how the RAS can shift and start this whole chain reaction, but for now this is what it could look like. And sure, aggregate demand can shift, and that's something that we should respect, but according to the real business cycle theory, what is more significant and which starts this whole downward spiral is the RAS shifting to the left. It's also why consumer confidence matters. So I would like you to click on this link to take a look at consumer confidence. The measurement of consumer confidence was begun in 1967 by the Conference Board, and that's really the official source of measuring consumer confidence. So later the theory is going to predict that a recovery will occur for the above situation once a pickup in productivity growth shifts LRAS to the right, but the emphasis on supply is what real business cycle theorists were all about. So, we've talked a whole lot about classical theorists, Keynesian theorists, including the new versions of them, and as you can see at this point, a lot of it comes down to, whether wages and prices are going to adjust, and if so, how quickly. If you're in the new classical camp, you believe that wages adjust quickly enough to consider the economy self-regulating and SORAS able to do the work. If you're a Keynesian or a new Keynesian, you believe that wages adjust so slowly that you can't say that the economy is self-regulating. You can't be hands-off. The government has to have an important role in managing the economy and stabilizing the economy. This is a summary chart, an illustration to show some of the differences, but also the common ground between the different versions of classical theorists. Monetarists fit within that camp, as well as Keynesians, but the evolution is pretty clear. There's a clean little secret of macroeconomics. Despite all this fighting and bickering, there's actually a great deal of consensus that's been reached over the past 70 years amongst economists.